these are human rights concerns of the highest level. The LGBT community is essentially under assault. The draft law, for example, that's being proposed, that would criminalize the LGBT community's activities, and also it would then stop and inhibit the LGBT community's ability to actually even convene. And we've seen actually that the authorities have begun to increase restrictions on the LGBT community actually gathering, with conferences and meetings being broken up. But on top of that, we're seeing an increasing environment where the LGBT community is being driven into a situation where they are fearful for their safety. Because what we have seen now is, for example, Human Rights Watch did some research where we saw that the digital space has now also become incredibly unsafe for the LGBT community. We've seen that information that's been posted by members of the LGBT community is then used by the security forces, for example, where they have gathered information on them and tried to use those for prosecutions, but also even non-governmental individuals have started to use that information and try and build dossiers to blackmail members of the LGBT community. And that has far-reaching implications for members of the LGBT community, including resulting in, they've been held hostage, asking them for money so that the information is not being made public. Their families have been notified, and therefore they've been ostracised from their families. It's meant that it's had wide-ranging implications on their ability to work, etc. The fact that there is any sort of prosecution of journalists who are simply doing their jobs and trying to hold leaders to account is always a very worrying sign for a deterioration in the wider human rights situation. But it's something that we've also seen in Lebanon, and it's characteristic of the lack of independence of the judiciary as well, where there has been political interference by political leaders on judges to be able to take forward these politically motivated cases and essentially gag journalists and any sort of criticism of those in power. I think that for the people of Lebanon, justice must be attainable. It shouldn't be a question. Absolutely, the domestic investigation has been paralysed because of corruption, but because of this issue of immunity as well. And this is now being caught up, in a system where the immunity that has been granted, even though the judicial authorities have actually indicated that immunity should be lifted for members of parliament, we haven't seen the political will to bring that to reality. So of course that is a significant barrier to ensuring that there's domestic justice, but this isn't just a concern for Lebanon. This is now a matter of international concern, and we saw last year that the Human Rights Council actually delivered a statement that has raised the issues of concern about what is happening in Lebanon and the lack of accountability for the Beirut blast. And what really needs to happen now is that since the domestic situation has failed the people of Lebanon and there has been no proper investigation, that there should be an international fact-finding mission that is able to collect evidence and be able to move the accountability process forward. Human Rights Watch stands with the family members to ensure that there is some sort of international fact-finding mission. The Lebanese authorities have had their chance. They're still able to do something, but if they fail to do so, this is one of the only ways out. The deportation of Syrian refugees back to Syria is an absolute human rights violation. First of all, the right to life and prohibiting torture. We know that Syria is still unsafe for Syrian refugees. To send them back knowing that they will potentially meet harm or even death is a violation of their rights and Lebanon's international obligations. At this stage, it's really for Lebanon to ensure that they are meeting their obligations and not sending refugees back to harm. But across the world, we have seen an increasing momentum and pushes to send Syrian refugees back to Syria. And it is absolutely important that even while we are seeing that there has been some sort of vague normalisation of relations, particularly within the Arab world, with the Assad government, that does not mean that Syria is safe for refugees to return. They deserve to have the right to stay where they are safe in countries like Lebanon, and we hope that the governments and the authorities in all of the countries which are, supporting and housing Syrian refugees will actually be able to normalise their status and give them access to the social services and the ability to reside until Syria is safe to return. When gender-based violence crimes are not prosecuted, that's a failure of the entire system, and it's a responsibility of the government to do something about it. What we've seen in terms of an increase in GBV in Lebanon, and actually escalating to the point that there have been killings, is not something that we should take and normalise. The Lebanese authorities just need to have the political will to put the right things in place, including ensuring that the police investigate when there have been incidents of domestic violence, that men are prosecuted when women go forward with evidence and cases of domestic violence, and when there are killings. Again, we are seeing how the politicisation of the judicial system is failing not just the Lebanese people in general, but also failing some of the most vulnerable groups, including women who are victims of domestic violence. We're seeing disturbing patterns across the region. In particular, we have seen, these laws that are all designed to shrink civic space. Now, we've been talking about LGBT laws, which are criminalising LGBT people in Lebanon, but we also see the crushing of space for freedom of expression and the media. I just came from Amman, where we've seen a cybercrime law that has been enacted that will essentially, make any sort of freedom of expression on the internet much more dangerous for journalists, for activists, for human rights defenders. And this pattern of shrinking civic space and these sort of networks of laws that governments are bringing in across the region to ensure that there's not criticism of the authorities and that there's not dissent is really alarming, and something that we need to push back against. There's solidarity is one of them. It's so important that Human Rights Watch stands with human rights defenders here in Lebanon and across the region. When we are seeing human rights under such a systematic assault, it is absolutely important that we stand together. We are not only fighting here in Lebanon, that we should use the institutions that we have access to hold the government authorities to account, but we should make these issues of international concern as well. And Human Rights Watch intends to stand with the brave human rights defenders here in Lebanon and across the region to do that.